Well, thanks, everybody. Oh, good. Yeah, we're being warned. We're being warned. Okay, good. Hello, everybody. Here's the
Hi.
plan. I'm going to read something and then chat a little bit and then read another thing. And as we start, I want to thank Neil. He's put together some nifty slides that we should enhance matters. So just to get started, I want to address a question that Neil asked me a good long while ago. How did you get into this? You might want to know what got this business going for me. To get us going, this is the first entry in the whole blog newsletter thing. To get us going, here's an account of how I, an English professor, recovering lawyer, and no nuclear insider, came to be interested in this business. I begin with this story, hoping it will inspire readers of these postings to believe that they too, as mere curious citizens, can become knowledgeable about nuclear weapons, and finally, as qualified as any nuclear insider to take part in deliberations about their future in our world. I agree with Albert Einstein, who said right after World War II that, quote, "To the village square, we must carry the facts of atomic energy. From there must come America's voice," close quote. And with J. Robert Oppenheimer, who argued in 1953 in Project Candor that we who are not insiders need to be part of the deliberations. At this point, it is clear that this is not a matter to be left entirely to the insiders and experts, who all too often are deeply invested in the status quo. I was born in 1941, so I grew up during and lived through the Cold War. 50 years later, at the end of 1991, to my amazement, the Soviet Union had dissolved. No longer was it a mortal threat to us. Russia and the other countries of the former Soviet Union didn't even want to be communist anymore. They wanted to be friends, it looked like. Hopes were high. In 1991, mine were high hopes. My wife, Tilly, and I had interesting new jobs. In 1990, we both had come to the University of Arizona to join the graduate program in rhetoric, composition, and the teaching of English in the English department. In summer 1991, we were teaching classes for the Breadloaf School of English in Santa Fe. Wonderful students, themselves teachers, most of them. One evening, we had gone with some of them to a performance of the Santa Fe Opera. The big opera house is north of town. Its ceiling is partly open to the sky. The back of the stage is open too and looks west. Framed in the opening, 30 miles away or so, was the dark flank of the Jemez Mountains. On it, a scattering of pretty lights. The lights of Los Alamos, I was told. I knew something about Los Alamos. It was the city that grew up after World War II around Site Y, the secret side of the scientific division of the Manhattan Project, the town that had no name. Site Y was where the first atomic bombs had been designed and built. Now it was the site of one of our two major nuclear weapons laboratories, the Los Alamos National Laboratory. A week later, I drove up to Los Alamos and saw the place in the center of town near Ashley Pond, where the gadget had been assembled. Clear something up here off my screen. The gadget was what the designers and engineers at Site Y called the first atomic bomb. On July 16th, 1945, in a test called Trinity, the gadget had exploded with a force equivalent to 40 million pounds of TNT. From Ashley Pond, I walked across the street and into Fuller Lodge, where Robert Oppenheimer, the director at Site Y, had hung his hat, literally, on a nail that was still there. And then next door to the Bradbury Museum of Science, managed at the time by the University of California, where the work of Lannel was represented. Actual size models of the two nuclear bombs dropped on Japan were on display. They were shaped very differently. How did these things work? Why were they so much more powerful than regular bombs? How much more powerful were they? I had only the vaguest idea about any of this. I remembered something I learned growing up. On August 6th, 1945, the day the atomic bomb called Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima, my father had been with the Navy in Okinawa, in command of a landing ship medium in Amphibious Group 1, Flotilla 1, preparing to invade the Japanese mainland. A few weeks later, his group did land on the beaches in Japan, flawlessly, he said, but it was after the surrender and they weren't taking fire. For a short time, he had occupied Japan. I have a photograph of him occupying Japan. He has a pistol on his hip. I asked him once if he'd heard what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and wanted to go see. He said he had heard about it, but he just wanted to get home. Home was Tucson, Arizona, where I and my little sister were living with our mother. I was 4.5 years old. My visit to Los Alamos in 1991 made me realize how ignorant I was about all of this, about the Manhattan Project, about how nuclear weapons work, about their actual effects, about developments during the Cold War, technical developments in weapons design, in weapons delivery systems, in intelligence gathering and surveillance, in strategy, in operational plans, in politics and policy. It wasn't that I hadn't been paying attention. Even in elementary school, I'd noticed the pictures in life. But all along, we'd been taught, those of us who weren't insiders, that it was none of our business. Even insiders with security clearance knew not to ask questions if they couldn't show a need to know. Curiosity invited suspicion. Never mind, we probably wouldn't understand anyway. I'd lived through the 40-some years of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, and like most of us, knew almost nothing about it. I did remember what I'd felt like in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and suddenly all of us at Tucson High were being made to feel we should be studying rocket science. I didn't know what I was interested in, but I knew it wasn't that, and felt guilty. And I remembered what it had felt like in 1962, as all of us here probably do. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I was at Amherst College, and we thought the end was nigh. I wondered what I'd do if I survived. Winter was coming. Canada wasn't a good idea. Tucson was awfully far away. I knew what I'd felt like in 1966 when I was at Oxford University and learned that back in Tucson, 18 launch sites for our new Titan II ICBM were under construction around the city. I didn't know then that the warhead on each of the 18 Titan IIs would be the W-53, and that it had a yield of 9 megatons. On that 9 megatons, or that 9 megatons was twice the power of all the explosives that had been detonated by all sides in World War II. 18 of them around Tucson. Tucson would have to be a target now, if it hadn't been before, if that mattered. I knew what it felt like in 1966 when I was a law school student at New York University and saw the news that one of our bombers flying over Spain on something called Airborne Alert had collided with its refueling tanker and crashed, and one of its 4 hydrogen bombs had been lost and, after a while, found. We got shown a photograph of that hydrogen bomb, the first hydrogen bomb I'd ever seen. Laid out on the deck of a ship, it looked like a big, somewhat shortened cigar canister. It had a dent in the nose. I knew what it felt like in the 1970s when I was teaching at the University of Wyoming in Laramie and realized that just over the hill in Cheyenne, 46 miles east of us, was Warren Air Force Base, the headquarters for one of our ICBM missile fields. One of my students wrote a paper about looking east over the Laramie Range and seeing missile tracks ascending. That day in the Bradbury, I could tell that some, maybe a lot of what we couldn't even ask about before the Cold War ended was going to become accessible now to those of us who still had any interest in it. I resolved to learn as much as I could about this era I'd lived through without having any idea what was actually going on, and write about it some way that caught what it was like to live through that time, that fearful, exciting, and anesthetized time, knowing and not knowing, and knowing we didn't know. Some way that enabled others to come to know what we might want to know, might need to know, and could know now. The entries in this newsletter are for those who might also want to know. So that's the first entry in the You Might Want to Know project. As we all know, not to trust origin stories too much, but I think that one's pretty close to what actually happened. That was a kind of starting point for me in just that kind of way. But in fact, it did not lead right away to You Might Want to Know. Not even close. What it led to was something that Neil is now going to show you in a slide that he prepared.
Which one?
One of the books.
Okay.
The first one. That's a slide that shows, that's a photograph of the Trinity explosion. That's a slide that shows the covers of the 6 books that I wrote, that I finished writing about two and a half years ago or so, before I started doing the You Might Want to Know project. You will notice that there's one for each decade of the Cold War, and a 6th book called Roads Not Taken that looks back from the point of view of someone who now has educated himself about some of these matters, to consider roads that weren't taken early in the Cold War that might have led to a different place. It's counter history. That's what it is. But I found it very interesting to reflect on that. But the first thing I did after forming that conviction that I would learn about these things is I began a chronology, and just gathered all of the information about different things that I could get. And the access to things was quite wonderful, and it kept getting more and more better. And so a little bit. And that chronology is now 700 pages long. It's still growing. It's got all kinds of kinds of things that it has in it. I began to notice they fell along 3 kind of major lines. One was the lived experience of the Cold War, my lived experience. The second one was the technical developments. And the third one was the policy and strategy developments. Those were sort of 3 general areas, each of which needed to be kind of treated differently. When I was writing about my own experience, it was an experience of one who might have wild surmises and might be seeing certain news and hearing certain speeches like Eisenhower's Cross of Iron speech or his military industrial complex speech, and wondering what to make of it. But the technical history, of course, had to be different. It had to be what was in fact actually happening. So that presented a kind of interesting question. How do you go back and forth between what was in fact happening and what the narrator, the limited understanding that he had? And so I struggle with that a good bit. Now, maybe the main thing is Laurie Osborne asked a wonderful question a while back that asked me, how did I come to the voice that that the You Might Want to Knows have? The voice in the books is in some ways is not quite, it's not the same at all as the You Might Want to Knows, but it shares some properties. I knew I didn't want to write something. I'd done a lot of work on literary nonfiction, and I was very interested in the kind of things that were kind of possibilities there were in the nonfiction realm that often went unrecognized. And I knew I didn't want to write a typical nonfiction book with the voice of the master, the voice of the expert. I knew it couldn't be a memoir because a memoir couldn't get at half of the stuff that I wanted to be able to get at. So in the end, I guess I fell back on the fact that, as Ed Packel reminded me a while back, we are all liberal arts graduates. None of this stuff scares us. Let's just go learn stuff. And that was the voice that I adopted, that Lori recognized. It's the voice of the student, the voice of the learner. And this is a voice that I think both projects share. It's not the voice of the person, delivering the definitive knowledge on the subject, though there are times when that's what's going on. But it always returns to the voice of the learner. And one of the reasons for that is that I hope that constitutes an invitation to readers to sort of feel they too can get there. And I think a lot of people, when we read these there are a lot of wonderful, good books about this subject, but usually when we read them, we're filled with admiration because of all that they've researched and all the good stuff they got from their freedom of information requests, and I wanted to deal just with stuff that was in the public domain, and I have done that with the exception of a few sort of interviews and things that happened along the way. And I wanted it to be something that seemed to people accessible in that way. And I'm still trying to do that in the You Might Want to Knows, because that seems to me kind of a crucial aspect of anything that will get the people those of us who were rendered ignorant and anesthetized during the Cold War, awakened to some of what's going on in this domain. The more I developed, the more I wrote, things just evolved a whole lot from the beginning. And the more I wrote and the more I developed the chronology, I realized there were so many interesting things, so many great characters, so many interesting sources of drama. And one of the sources was in the technical developments. Everything from, guidance systems to the things that we managed to get missiles to do. Both sides managed to get missiles to do. The whole business of nuclear fission itself. So there was just a lot of stuff. I never felt any lack in that respect of that kind of interest in the account, and I could access it given the voice that I was trying to develop. Neil prepared another slide that maybe we could look at a second, and then I'll move on to the second reading. Could you show that slide of the contents? On my author's website, which is one of the ones listed in the chat, I have sort of much fuller accounts of the contents of each of the books. And as it happens, book 3, which is the longest of the books, 1959 to 69, there was a lot going on there. And Neil made this slide out of my selection of what went on during our years together at Amherst. And you can sort of quickly, we're not going to spend a lot of time with this, but you can sort of look through and see some of the things, and maybe just ask yourself, what did you know at the time? What did you not know? What did you suspect? What was any part of your education in any significant way? And interestingly, that's one thing that's been a whole lot of fun about working on this, is that talking to people, the reach of this business, the reach of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race is absolutely stunning when you start thinking about it. And you can almost meet no one who doesn't have a story to tell you. They haven't thought about it. Maybe they don't think of it as significant. They don't know what to do with it. But there's some. My Uncle Buzzy was a metallurgist at Los Alamos. My father-in-law was a plutonium chemist at Met Lab, and you keep hearing these things, and that's been another source of energy for me. So just wanted to have a look at that to see some of the things. At our last reunion, I know some of you probably went out to the library that's out in the Holyoke Range, that was built while we were being built while we were there. It was an alternate command center for the Strategic Air Command for the commanders that were at Westover, and that I had no idea that it was being built there at the time. And now it has gone on to experience the fate of many of these huge undertakings during the Cold War nuclear arms race. Okay, let me go on to the last reading, which is one of the you might want to know, is it's one of the earlier ones, so maybe you all won't have seen it. And this is one where the things I made a really fun discovery that I've not seen talked about anywhere, but it's really I enjoyed it. The title of this one is, "Did any of our presidents ever witness a nuclear detonation?" No, not one. Why not? Unlike those of us who weren't insiders, they could have gotten to see whatever they wanted. Why hadn't they? Isn't that something they should have done? Or did they think they already knew what they needed to about what nuclear weapons do? Might they have believed that because the bomb was as terrible as at some level they knew it to be, they needed not to experience it directly because it might somehow make them hesitant to use it? In any case, like the rest of us, they saw only photographs. I'm going to skip a section. I go through what the various presidents and the kind of testing and explosions they could have seen if any of them had gone to see it, but none of them ever did. In July 1962, a year and a half after JFK had become president, Bobby Kennedy came to the Nevada test site. He witnessed what was to be the last above-ground test we would conduct there. A test of one of the smallest warheads we ever produced, the W-54, also known as the Davy Crockett. The W-54 weighed around 50 pounds, and in the test yielded the equivalent of 20,000 pounds of TNT. Minuscule for an atomic bomb. That was as close as we got to one of our presidents witnessing a detonation. In 1963, during Kennedy's administration, the Soviet Union and the United States decided we needed to limit the poisonous radioactivity that was being released by above-ground tests, and concluded the Partial Test Ban Treaty. No more tests in the atmosphere. Testing wasn't banned, but all tests thereafter, by those two countries at least, were to be conducted underground. Now there would be no pictures even, no new ones, that is. Pictures of a heaving of the earth, maybe. Among actual witnesses of above-ground nuclear detonations, Harold Agnew had to have been unique. As a recent college graduate, he had been present under the football stands at the University of Chicago when the first nuclear chain reaction, a controlled nuclear chain reaction in this case, was achieved in Enrico Fermi's Pile 1 on December 2, 1942. Agnew had helped build Pile 1. 3 years later, Agnew had been present at the Trinity test, the first explosion on Earth of an atomic device. Less than a month after that, from the great artiste, the B-29 that flew with the Enola Gay to Hiroshima, Agnew took the movies of the mushroom cloud over the city that are the only pictures we have from the air of the event. 3 days later, at our airfield on Tinian, he helped assemble Fat Man, the bomb that would be dropped on Nagasaki. Neil has a slide he'll show us after this on that. You may have seen the photograph of him at the base on Tinian, carrying in one hand the small reinforced metal box that contained the grapefruit-sized plutonium core for the Nagasaki bomb. The Hiroshima bomb, Little Boy, and the Nagasaki bomb, Fat Man, were small nuclear bombs by today's standards. In the 1950s, however, Agnew also witnessed most of the major hydrogen bomb tests conducted at our Pacific Proving Ground, including the biggest one, Castle Bravo, in 1954. The shrimp device in the Bravo test yielded 15 megatons. He is the only person who witnessed all of that, as far as I know. From July 1970 to 1979, Agnew served as the third director, following Oppenheimer and Norris Bradbury, of the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Los Alamos was where our first atomic bombs were designed, and then the place where most of our nuclear weapons were designed over the years. In a hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on September the 8th, 1977, Agnew testified, "I firmly believe that if every 5 years the world's major political leaders were required to witness the in-air detonation of a multi-megaton warhead, progress on meaningful arms control measures would be speeded up appreciably." In 1984, according to an article in the Los Angeles Times, he added that every leader should be in his underwear for the experience. Quote, "So he feels the heat and understands just what he's screwing around with. Once you've seen one, it's rather sobering." If what Agnew recommended were done, we know now that the radioactive fallout released would kill some of us eventually. We wouldn't be able to say how many exactly, only within a range. We wouldn't be able to say who, and we wouldn't be able to say when. But some of us would die before our time. That much was certain. Even so, might we want to choose, we and Russia, of course, but also the other seven nuclear weapon states there are now, to do what Agnew recommended? Might we decide that the deaths that would follow would be for us, even if we ourselves became one of those who died early, an acceptable sacrifice? You can sign me up as supporting this. All the leaders of the nuclear weapon states would need to be present, of course. I agree they should be in their underwear. So Neil has another slide to show you. In the box that Agnew was carrying was an object that looked almost exactly like this. That is the exact size of the plutonium fissile fuel that was in that box that Harold Agnew was carrying. The hand, as it happens, is the hand of Richard Rhodes, who wrote The Making of the Atomic Bomb, one of the really important books in this area. That object yielded the equivalent of 22,000 tons of TNT. So I would love to hear what anybody thinks, what anybody would like to know, what questions anybody has.
Okay, that's great. So we don't talk over each other, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. James Sherwood.
First off, John, I'll summarize all my thoughts. And the wonderful thing about these seminars is who knew? Um, we tend to think of ourselves as we were in 1963, or maybe an occasional contest or a conversation at a reunion. But it's so exciting to learn these things from people who knew. John, I'm asking you my knowledge on this field is limited to two works of maybe, almost fiction. One is In the Matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a play written about his trial and loss of his security clearance, I guess, after this. And I think that was written in the late 60s or 70s. Mm-hmm. And then much more recently, a mystery novelist, Joseph Cannon, wrote a book called Los Alamos, which I assume he sets a mystery at the time they're working on it. And of course, conveniently, his plot and the bomb go off on the same day. It's very stirring, and I assume it's accurate portrayal. What do you think?
I have, as it happens, read both of those. I read the Cannon book quite a little while ago. Let me quickly recommend another fiction account called Stallion Gate, which is the gate to the Trinity site, which has got a great premise, which is a Native American guy from Los Alamos who features in the last scene just before the detonation. But so Stallion Gate's a fun one. I don't remember the Cannon book all that well, but I think, when somebody writes a fiction book and they call it that, that's usually to give themselves room not to worry too much about certain things. And so I'm quite confident, like Chernobyl, for example, that series had a lot of good stuff in it about what actually happened at Chernobyl, but also a lot of stuff that didn't. Oh. Stuff that made it a better drama for television. So there's no doubt that a lot of that, because it really is like stealing. There's so much that is dramatic that's actually there already. Yeah. But I think when it's a fictional account, you're going to find people fudging a little bit.
Mm-hmm. John, I have a question for you.
Great to see you, Jim.
What do you think of the CTBTO and its technical and policy functions?
I have to admit, not having studied that really very carefully, it's kind of not part of my project. We're talking about the Iran Treaty, right?
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
The technical role of the CTBTO includes multidisciplinary nuclear test detection.
I see. My understanding is, and I really need to be very diffident here. My understanding is that our testing capacity is really excellent. And I'm sure we're continuing to work on making it better. But the last worry about detection had to do with whether we could detect small underground nuclear explosions. That was the thing that kept a lot of people from a lot of American congressmen apparently so you're talking about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I see, I apologize, I get it. And that's the thing that caused them to hesitate. They were afraid we couldn't detect very small underground nuclear explosions. So the Russians would, as it was always assumed, they would cheat and they do this. And at one point there was a worry that people would do testing up in space where it couldn't be detected. So there's always been worries about that. I just have to say, what kind of advantage do we think they're going to get by conducting tests of that kind that somehow make the situation more perilous than it already is? I think, for example, about the new developments in the hypersonic cruise missiles, as if, an ICBM, when it comes in, is going 17,000 miles an hour. That is hypersonic. They're already hypersonic. So this is going on with a kind of inertia that is inertia, and I don't see it often having a legitimate rationale from my point of view, and I think that's why I have this strong feeling that this is not a matter for the experts. If you are in the nuclear enterprise, chances of conflict of interest are just too great. Is that a good enough answer for your question?
I think I get what you're driving at.
No, I think we should sign. I think that should be signed. I think the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty should be signed.
Okay, anyone else? You must have some questions or memories or whatever.
This is
Ted?
it. I have a question for John. Or, I've been following this issue about the decision to drop the bomb and the concerns that many expressed. But there's a new book out that I read about the other day called Restricted Data, The History of Nuclear Secrecy. And what is clear is the government has concealed from people the consequences of the bomb, because it was triggered by a Black reporter who reported in a Black newspaper that there was huge radiation fallout from the dropping of these bombs. And the government denied it entirely. They said that the bomb was safe and it didn't have these kind of, and it raises an interesting issue as to how we can have an open debate about the role of nuclear weaponry if we don't have open access to information, consequences, and testing, so we can have a debate. And I'm curious, John, as to what you think about that, whether we really will have the government be more open about some of the consequences that can result from this that haven't really, in a sense, been highlighted before.
I wouldn't hold my breath on that. I have read the restricted data book, and he has the author's name is Alex Wellerstein, and he has produced a fascinating website called Nuke Map, one word, and Google would bring it up for you. And on that map, you can detonate a bomb of any yield on any point on the world map and see where the various, where the fire, how big the fireball is, how big the radiation damage, how big the blast damage, and so forth, and including fallout patterns. So, yeah, no, I think Wellerstein is just, I think he's something, and he has a really good book TV session too that somebody.
How does one get a copy of your book, John, to read?
Well, unfortunately, will you publish it for me first so that you can read it? No, the idea that you would get 6 books on this subject published by anybody in this climate of publishing is a little iffy. And so far, I don't have a publisher for those books. What I have is that's one of the reasons I started with the Substack thing. At least it was a way of getting stuff out there. So Ed, I would love to accommodate. But
That's too
Okay,
bad.
Ted and Chris. Chris, you have been waiting longer, I think.
Yeah, hi, how are you? Thanks.
hey,
It's a
Chris,
pleasure here. I'm Chris. I'm son of Dr. Lawrence Osborne, who's
I know that. Great to see
I'm
you.
his son and an interested student of this kind of content as well.
Yes,
Really
indeed.
appreciate your work. Have you heard of a theorist from the 1950s named Brody, who pioneered the idea of a weapon to not be used, essentially? What is the danger of that kind of thinking in your view? And then what do you think of him? I was just given a sort of a cursory sketch of some of his thinking.
Bernard Brody, yeah, he's a very, very important figure whose thinking I think is still relevant. But could you say more about a weapon not being used? What is the issue that you want to comment on?
Sure. Yeah, the concept of sort of reversing the paradigm that throughout history, weapons have always been created with the intent of being used to cause harm, whereas a nuclear weapon is the reverse, that it has all this destructive power, yet its inception is inspired by a hope to never have to use it, essentially. I mean, deterrence.
I think the important thing in what you said there is hope. I think I don't know whether it is only that, and it can only be that, right? Jill Lepore called the deterrence idea a fearful faith. And I think that's a lovely expression for what it is, because it is a faith. It's not something that can ever be proved, but it's something that grows out of fear, and it's a faith that it works. And in many cases, we know that deterrence doesn't work, and we don't know that it doesn't work really until it actually doesn't. So as long as it doesn't work, we can continue to maintain that faith. When Obama gave his speech in Prague, his foreign policy speech where he declared our intention to seek a world without nuclear weapons, he had a sentence in it which was, if these weapons exist, they will someday be used. And I guess I believe that. If they are not used by a nation, and even the four horsemen, Kissinger and the other sort of mavens of the nuclear establishment, they came to believe that deterrence might have worked, appears to have worked, when it was two nations at odds. But in a world in which terrorists are operating, deterrence doesn't compute anymore. Let's say they managed to smuggle in enough U-235 to set off a 10 kiloton blast in the Washington Mall. What are you going to bomb back? Are they going to worry about dying in the course of doing that? It just doesn't. Deterrence just doesn't work in that circumstance. So as Obama said in that same speech, while the danger of a nuclear war has gone down, the danger of a nuclear attack has gone up in recent years. And that's kind of where I end with that. What do you think, Chris? Chris does this wonderful Warrior Maven website that you ought to look at. He's a hoss.
I know. It's a pleasure hearing you. Nice to be here. Thank you. This is great.
Right.
Ed, you wanted to ask something?
Yes. Mine is, thank you, John, for a very informative, if somewhat depressing presentation.
I can't tell who's talking. Is it?
Ted Truman is talking.
Oh, Ted. Good.
Okay, Ted Truman is talking. I should change my name to say Ted, but very informative, very depressing. It's hard to disagree with your last exchange. I have a sort of in terms of your historical discussion, and I was actually struck by the part of your presentation where you talked about presidents who had not, multiple presidents who had not witnessed a nuclear explosion. And I guess one question would be whether any other chief of state has done so. But my question is, you did say that Bobby Kennedy had. And do you draw any connection between the fact that he had done that before the Cuban Missile Crisis and his role in at least according to most accounts in the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Did that help him? Did that shape? Do you think, or is there evidence that shaped his thinking in that context?
I don't think so, Ted. I don't. What he saw was such a tiny test by all standards. I mean, it would have been impressive, of course, but it wasn't the multi-megaton test that Harold Agnew thought might have the salutary effect that he described. And as I read what went on in the negotiations around the Cuban Missile Crisis, the thing that emerges for me is the fact that, that was such a tit for tat, wasn't it? I mean, we had, in 1959, we had put up we had stood up in Turkey and Italy and Great Britain intermediate range nuclear missiles that could reach Russia. And hey, so they come over and set them up in Cuba. They had those. So they set them up in Cuba, and we could have said, well, okay, fair is fair, but that's not kind of how it worked out. And one of the reasons it worked out that way is that Kennedy traded with Khrushchev, from what I've read. I'm
Yes.
not an insider. In that.
Turkey for Cuba,
Sorry.
Turkey for Cuba, or Cuba for Turkey.
Well, actually, Jupiter's. He agreed to take the Jupiter IRBMs, which were in Turkey and Italy. He agreed to take those out of service. He couldn't take the Thors out of England, but he agreed to take those out of service if they would take their missiles out of Cuba. So it was a trade. But the way it was styled and the way Kennedy let it be styled was that Kennedy made Khrushchev blink. And I think that had an unfortunate effect. Apparently LBJ even believed that. And just that the way you make progress in these areas is to be a hard ass and be a Curtis LeMay or something, who, by the way, wanted to nuke Cuba, as I think you know, that was the advice he gave JFK. Should attack with nuclear weapons. He'd assumed they didn't have the warheads in there, which they did, including tactical weapons. So that would have been, God knows how that would have unfolded. But I think that's kind of how I read that. I don't think it was a matter of Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, having gotten religion, having seen the Davy Crockett go up.
Ed.
John, in your writings, have you encountered the name John von Neumann? And if you have, if you haven't, I recommend you add him to your ramblings, because he's a critical figure in the 20th century, co-author of the first creation of game theory,
Right,
involvement with the starting of the digital computer,
right,
development of quantum mechanics, and I
Yeah.
believe he was at Los Alamos as well.
right.
He was sort of a resident genius and a card. He was a jokesman as well.
Right.
Anyway, I look forward to seeing something about him in your next blog, or whatever you wanted to call it.
Well, I do know about him. I mean, he was obviously a really important figure in all of this, in just the ways you describe. I don't know of any book that sort of deals with his work. Do you, Ed, that deals with it, in the kind of context I'd be interested in, rather than say, I did know he made an important contribution to game theory, which certainly had a role in the Cold War. But
I know he. I've read articles about him in math journals and things, but I don't know about a book.
well, he and Edward Teller were both Hungarian Jews, and they were the people that made some people in Los Alamos ask, what did they have in the water over there in Hungary?
Right. I see.
So, but
Okay.
I really don't know much about him in detail. I know he was very important, but I haven't found any kind of dramatic.
You have my permission to research him some more, John.
Thank you, sir.
I'll ask a question, John.
Yes, sir.
How do we get out of this mess? How do we get to some sort of world without the threat that is hanging over all of us?
Yeah.
Have you any ideas?
Yes and no. The second entry in the You Might Want to Know project takes up that question, and it's under the heading, where do I come out on the matter of nuclear abolition? And I have to say that, again, I come out where I think Obama was wanting to take us. The first thing that has to happen is a commitment to a world without nuclear weapons. After that, I don't know. I mean, there are various kinds of things you could say that might help, but the commitment has to be made, and it has not been made. From what Chris was talking about earlier, a lot of people believe that those weapons keep the peace. They're good. And I'm afraid I think, I look at that the way I look at a lot of the arguments for gun ownership in the home. The statistics show that if you have a gun in the home, you're more likely to die than if not. And so I'm just not sure that I don't have any specific things to. If I were in those circles, I'm sure I'd be thinking about it and trying to come up with concrete proposals. I'm wondering if George is still here. I think George might be the one, George Peterson might be the one to ask about that, but I don't, except that there's a sine qua non, and that is the commitment.
Steve,
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
What do you think is the larger threat to the future of the world as we know it and the human race? The atomic situation, nuclear situation as you described it, or climate change?
Does it depend? Does a lot depend on what I pick? I think not. But what's interesting, Steve, is that about the doomsday clock. Everybody knows about that. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists every year sets the clock at where they think midnight is world catastrophe, and they set the minute hand at how close to midnight they think we are. Currently, it is at 100 seconds to midnight. That was the last setting. It came down from 2 minutes to midnight. That was the previous setting. And for a while now, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been including climate dangers in with nuclear dangers. I mean, very explicitly, that is something that they find very worrying. I also have read, I've never verified this, but I've also read that the Pentagon lists climate change as one of the major security threats to the United States. So, there are a lot of people who are waking up to it. But I do think that our failure to address the problems of the existence of nuclear weapons the way in which we failed and are thinking about that is very like the way we failed to think about what needs to be done to address climate change. It bumps up against national borders, and then it founders.
Yeah.
Fallout doesn't respect borders, nor does climate. I mean, so we somehow have to find a way beyond that. And as soon as you say that, people will be saying, "Oh, you're talking one world and world government," and so it's a terrible problem to which I do not have the answer.
Thank you.
maybe this is the reason our silence shows the reason that people don't want to think about this, don't want to, it's just too much. Is that your interpretation, John? I'm not accusing us of not thinking about it. We're holding this session, of course, but it's something that's so awful that we don't want to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of things. We have to find a way to think about the unthinkable. Imagine the unimaginable. People have said, I think it was Martin Amis has this wonderful saying in a book he wrote called Einstein's Monster. He says, if we think about nuclear weapons, we feel sick. If we don't think about nuclear weapons, we feel sick and don't know why. and I think that is what you're talking about is a very important part of all of it. We have to find a way to somehow deal with what we can about this. That's pretty lame. I'm sorry.
John, this is Jay Silberg. I may have missed it earlier, but did you describe at all the 1954 Eisenhower Atoms for Peace proposal, which kind of was an attempt to think about it, whether it was intended to be a solution or intended to be a challenge that he knew the Soviets couldn't match? What do you think about that? And have we been there before?
I have not addressed that in the You Might Want to Knows, but I do in the book that deals with that decade. Some people think that that was a poker move by Eisenhower, that it wasn't really serious. He knew that we had a huge advantage in fissile fuel at that point, and that the Russians could not agree to his proposal to deposit fissile fuel, the same amount of fissile fuel, without seriously harming their position. Everything I've seen about Eisenhower makes me think he really put his faith in a massive buildup of nuclear weapons. He thought, that was the only thing you could do. I'm not sure he really believed in the Atoms for Peace thing. He had a guy on his staff, the guy who nailed Oppenheimer, Lewis Strauss, he's the guy who said that electricity would soon be too cheap to meter because of nuclear power reactors. And the guy didn't really get a lot of stuff, but so I don't know. I've gone up and down about Eisenhower, but right now I guess I'm down.
Let me just add one point to the too cheap to meter. That really is a phony argument, because he was not, Admiral Strauss was not talking about nuclear power reactors of the kind we know. What he was talking about was figuring out a way to generate electricity from nuclear fusion, which we're still trying to do, and actually is getting a lot of money thrown into it.
Right.
But people use that as a whipping boy for the nuclear industry, and it's wrong. And I've talked to Admiral Strauss' daughter, who confirmed that was what he was talking about.
Yeah. Well, no, I understand that, and I know that Edward Teller thought that we could do clean bombs because we'd find a way to build bombs that would use only fusion and no fission, which turned out not to be possible. But still, that was a long way in the future to be predicting that at that moment. Maybe he wasn't talking about fission, but I don't know that changes our judgment of that judgment by him.
Okay, Chris, did you have another question? Your hands
Yeah,
up.
hi, thank you so much. So I get absorbed with the content. This is great. What do you think of tactical nuclear weapons? The notion of the previous nuclear posture review calling for a submarine launched nuclear armed cruise missile, or Russia's regular talk about tactical arsenal?
Well, a submarine launched nuclear cruise missile, we have those. I understand you would know better than I, but I believe we have those already. They can be launched from a submerged submarine.
Yes, the Trident II was modified to include nuclear weapons in a submarine launch, like lower yield capacity. Yes.
Yeah, I think tactical weapons is a chimera, really, because let's take our B-61 bomb, for example. That could be set to yield 300 tons, I understand. That's tactical. But it can also be set to yield like 360 or something kilotons. So here comes one. Is it tactical or is it strategic? And I just don't think the lines can be drawn there. I just don't think they can be drawn. And I don't think they can, I know I'm not alone on that. Colin Powell, I've got a column about this. Colin Powell at one point said nuclear weapons are useless. And I think what he meant by that was, that'll be one you might want to know, but they're just, you can't keep them in the bottle in a tactical kind of way because they are so huge. I talked to a guy, I posted something about this about 6 posts ago, I think. I met a guy here at the internet. This is one of these things that happens. I met this colleague who got in touch with me, who had been in charge of a nuclear howitzer, he was a special weapons officer with a nuclear howitzer stationed at Dachau, of all places, with the gun pointed at the Fulda Gap, which was the place where the Russians were supposed to come pouring through when they invaded Europe. That was the assumption. And one of the things he said was, we really didn't, we did all this stuff that we were asked to do, but we thought if we ever shot one of these things off, that would be it. There'd be no point. There'd be nothing after that for us. That was their working assumption. What they were basing that on, I guess I'm not sure, because it was a weapon that had a yield that I think would have allowed them to be survivable given the range of that howitzer they were using. But anyway, that's another interesting part of the story, the actual beliefs of the people who were handling these things. So yeah, I know. I think I don't think I've posted anything on tactical, but I've got a series on strategic versus tactical and whether that makes any sense. And my conclusion is it doesn't really. In the last analysis,
I'm sure you've heard of the LRSO, the long-range standoff weapon, the nuclear armed cruise missile, and the big debate. Some on the Hill were saying, hold on a minute, it could be mistaken. A conventional attack could be thought of as a possible nuclear attack.
Right.
And sure enough, set something off.
Right. And my question about that is, does it add 1 penny's worth to our deterrence if you believe in it? I can't see that it does. Does it add anything to the deterrence that the Trident II missiles give us? To the deterrence capability? I can't see it. That seems to me to be a beautiful example of the inertia of the establishment just continuing to come up with these things and tit for tatting with the Soviets. So I can't see that. And your point about how easily it would be to mistake an attack that was not, that was only tactical as something else is really an important one. Because with nuclear weapons, you can't wait to figure it out later. It's the use it or lose it principle, as they put it, right? So.
Okay, we go on usually till about 1:15. Anyone else want to have a comment or a question? Okay, I want to thank you, John. I want to thank you not only for this, but also for your efforts over the years. It is such an important topic. We have to think about and do something about. Question is what?
Yeah, that is the question. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for taking the time, and please feel free to get in touch whenever you're inclined to about any of this.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Laurie, do you want to say something about September? Are you there? Well, anyway.
He was there without a picture.
He's there without a picture and without a voice at the moment.
It muted, yeah.
Anyway, on the second Wednesday of next month, I believe Laurie is going to talk about health issues and his stories about what he's experienced as a person running a hospital. So that ought to be interesting. It ought to be Maybe a little less serious than this one. But I really appreciate all you folks joining us. And this is about it, I guess.
I just wanted to throw in to Jim Sherwood's point, if any of you know, or any of you or anyone in our class that you know has such an interesting body of information like what John has just shared with us, please let us know, because we would love to give them this podium and the opportunity to share with the rest of us, which has just made this whole Zoom enterprise for the last year and a half such a rich one for us to be able to share with each other. So,
Oh, there you are, Laurie. You can see your face.
Unmute, Laurie. Unmute.
he's still muted now, his picture went away. Am I on
Hey.
mute now?
Yes.
Hello?
Hurrah.
Am I unmuted now?
You are unmuted. Speak away.
I'm sorry, my Zoom did not work on my new MacBook Pro, which is a lot smarter than I am. So I went back to my phone and that wasn't working very well. But John, it's just spectacular. Thank you very, very much. And I guess by way of leading up to next month, I would say to equate the danger to humanity from nuclear weapons with climate change. I might add a third one, which is microorganisms and virology and pandemics, which do not respect borders. And the bugs are winning in many, many ways. There's a lot of evidence. And I don't think we're prepared or likely to be prepared for a really lethal variant that could come along, a smallpox, that makes me almost equally scared. Next month, I'm simply going to relate some personal stories I had as a doc looking at the seedy and greedy side of medicine. And unfortunately, some of the things that I learned, the problems are still with us today. And I'm not terribly hopeful, and I'm pretty scared about this country's ability to respond to public health in a meaningful way, both in terms of justice for human beings and also with safety for humanity. So with that sort of doomsday note, I'll say thank you again, John. Marvelous presentation.
Yes,
And
thank
thank
you so
you,
much.
Neil, for hosting.
Okay, well, I think that's about it. So take care and have a great rest of the summer. And don't forget, I need class notes by the end of the month.
Neil
Let me know what you've been up to.
and Neil.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, can you stay for a minute? I apologize for my screw up. I just was not technically competent.
No, I'll stay online.
Okay, thank
Anybody
you.
else who wants to?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John. That was great. Yeah, thank you very much. So Neil, the first mistake I did is I did a Zoom upgrade a week or so ago and learned that the Zoom upgrade was probably a scam. And then my Zoom stopped working.
Oh,
So then I went back and reinstituted the original Zoom, and I thought that was working, but it certainly didn't work today. But my phone recovered somewhat. So my apologies for being technically incompetent.
Oh, all of us have trouble with Zoom at one time or another, I think.
Yeah, and Bill, thank you for your great ideas about keeping up the Zoom thing. We're certainly dedicated to doing it. And I think to have maybe a planning session in December when we're having the vacation is good. Catherine Sanderson is lined up for October. Or what were we going to do in November? Professor Corrales on Cuba. Oh, great. Wonderful. And listen, I'm going to drive over and drop pictures off for everybody. We'll have about 10 of them left. And I'll either give them to the Goodwill or to bring them to the 60th reunion. One I think we may have forgotten was the fellow who did the
trustee presentation to us last month. We were
Oh,
going to
good.
send one to him as well.
All right, good idea.
And actually, I had